presentation. We will have opportunity for questions. I will call for questions, so if you wouldn't mind just being patient with me, because we have folks both on the phone and in the room. So today's agenda, we're going to look at the standards development process. We're going to look at that from two perspectives. We're going to look at it from a technical or a more deep dive into what is a X12 transaction, and then we're going to understand it also not only from the X12 side of it, so the developer side, but we're also going to consider it in terms of what we do with it here at UHIN, because ultimately you have to implement them. So that leads into our next section, which is understanding how to implement them. And I need two trading partners, both a payer and a provider, to fully implement a transaction. So we'll be looking at that from both sides of that coin, if you will. And finally, let's talk about how we can change these, or how do we make them better, or potentially develop a new transaction. So those are our topics for today, and you will see there are definitive breaks within the presentation that shows what parts and pieces we're going to look at. Okay. So when we talk about the standards development, we are talking about the ANSI X12 organization. That is a volunteer organization that invites members of our industry to actually participate with the development of these transactions. What's interesting to note is that there are about 200 to 300 people that actually participate with these transactions that end up making the rules for the entire healthcare industry. So it's a very small group of people that actually end up doing all the heavy lifting, and it is all volunteer work. So people spend their time and their talents and their best information that they know to be able to get these things going. What's interesting also to note is we're heavy in the payer arena, but that's because payers most often have the ability to send people to these meetings or to actually assign them to listening in on the conference calls and things that happen. So if any providers are out there, I strongly encourage that you participate as much as your organization will allow you to, because in order to make these transactions work properly, we really do need to understand the workflow and the information that are accessible to our providers. So in addition to these meetings that I've alluded to here on this screen, they also have what we call interim calls. Interim calls are made throughout the month. Most of the time they're twice a month, like they'll be the first and third or the second and fourth week, and they're generally an hour long. These calls can be taken. I mean, I've been in my car driving, listening to my calls. Don't tell UHIN. So I have been able to take these calls wherever I'm at, and it is really important that you participate with the discussions, because based on those discussions, that's where the decisions are made. That's why I say it's very important to have your voice heard, because if nobody hears it, they can't make a decision with all the information. In addition to the interim meetings, there is a portion of the X12 website that is called the iMeet. And in iMeet, what they do is they put out all the documentation, a lot of discussion goes on. So even if you can't attend a standing meeting, or maybe you have to miss a meeting or three, if you will, in the during the interim meeting cycle, what we would like you to do is to look at the hang on, we need to close that down. So you have an opportunity to review the documentation and any discussion that might be going on, because the final bottom line of these standards is that these decisions are made by a voting process, and that's a 51% or better. So if you can get out there, you can vote, you can look at the information. This is your opportunity to participate within this particular process, and I strongly encourage all of you to do so. When we're talking about this process, What we're talking about are these following transactions. So these are, by and large, HIPAA transactions, and this is the product that is developed by X12. So I think you're all familiar with a majority of these. And I do have a question for you. This is going to be somewhat participatory, basically just by a raise of hand. If you believe there's a transaction on there that's not a HIPAA transaction, would you raise your hand? Okay, we have one raise of hand, and that is true. One of these transactions is not a HIPAA transaction. Do you happen to know which one, Dave? Attachments. He's 100% correct. While attachments is spoken to within the legislation of the rule, it is not as of yet an adopted transaction. And I say as of yet because I have breaking news for you. And the breaking news for you is the unified agenda that was put out by CMS includes attachments, which means we will in fact have a rule for attachments in 2018. So, for those of you that are here that are going to take information back, you've got the news up in front. So that's why it's convenient. We find this stuff out. We know what's going on. So, you know, again, here's all of the different transactions that are created that are within the HIPAA rules, or still will be in the HIPAA rules. So what these transactions do, in reality, there's actually two types of documents or reports that are created for these transactions. The first one is what we call the TR3, or the technical report. You folks will probably have known them if you've been in the industry very long as implementation guides. But they do have a technical term, and it's a TR3. And that is what all of the transactions, I think, that you're familiar with, that you saw on the slide previously. But there's also another document, which is called a TR2. And that's, if you will, somewhat of a companion guide that does a deeper dive into potentially a portion or just a piece of the guide. So the one that we have most, or that we know most, that's most predominant is with the 835. There's the Clark-Rourke report. So when we talk about these reports, it's actually these work groups. I wanted to bring this forward to you because I want you to understand these are the work groups that I really do believe you should participate with in terms of the X12 work groups. So what you'll notice right off the bat is the numbers do not coincide with the list that I gave you, and also the names are a little bit different. So work group 1, it says benefit information. That's actually the eligibility transaction. Work group 2, healthcare claims and attachments. So there is not a separate work group for attachments. That's actually done within the claim work group. So oftentimes you will have two sets of discussions going on within that work group. Work group 3, payment information. That's the 835 or the electronic remittance advice. Work group 4, invoice and premium payment. That's actually pretty consistent with what we know that work document to be. And then work group 5 is claim status. Interesting about that is it originally was by itself, then they took it into claims, then they split it back out. So as of last meeting, it became its own work group again. So if you have interest in the claim status or the claim acknowledgement, that's a good work group to get involved with. And then you have services review. That's actually the prior authorization and referral. And then enrollment information is enrollment into a health plan. One of the things that's really interesting is that these groups not only provide those transactions that are HIPAA transactions, but they also deal with non-HIPAA transactions. So when you see the healthcare claims and attachments, in that particular work group, we also have what we call the PACTOR, or what is known as the reporting claim guide. So that is being looked at by CMS at this time to be able to pull the claim data without actually having the claim there. And then also, when we look at the claim status, it isn't just the 276, 277, but also the claim acknowledgement, which you folks are very familiar with because we use that here in Utah. So these work groups really do provide a lot of information to our industry, and they do more than one kind of guide. In other words, they do more than HIPAA. Now let's take all that information and talk about what we do here at UHIN. Well, at UHIN, we do also develop standards. Our standards are basically business standards. So while you'll have the utilization of the transaction within the X12, and they do have business rules, I won't say they don't, there are times when we here at UHIN, and when I say UHIN, I mean you folks, when our community decides that they want to constrain or further define a transaction, that is allowed. Any state rule can actually further define any federal rule. You cannot contradict, and you cannot, if you will, loosen up the rules, but you most assuredly can constrain them. So that's what we do here. We get together and we talk about those things that are, if you will, a little bit loose. We tighten them up or further define them or make them more manageable here in the state of Utah. That's why we've been so successful here at UHIN. We don't just take what's out there and try to implement it 400 ways. One of my friends in X12 used to say, yeah, there's one standard and 400 implementations. What we try to do here at UHIN is further that down to, you know, maybe 100 or 200. No, I'm teasing, guys. But what we do truly is we get that and we move it down. What's unique to know about the UHIN standards process is that we make our decisions based on consensus. That's very hard because that means everybody has to agree or has to say, yes, I can live with that. So the idea is that nobody goes away from the table saying, dang it, I didn't win, because in the end, UHIN is interested in win-win solutions, not in, you know, you have to do what we say solutions, but to be able to make sure that we all get all the information that we need at the right time. Our standards development process, I wanted to bring this forward, and I don't know how well you guys here in the room can see it or even on the phone. It's kind of a busy process, so I've included both the pictorial representation as well as the wording. But the whole idea here truly is that when we identify a need, or perhaps there's a mandate, whether that be federal, state, or even if we had a local, I haven't ever had a local one, but you know, usually it's either a federal or state mandate, we bring that discussion up at our standards meetings. So we're starting to talk about attachments now. And what we will do is we'll look and see if we need to do anything in terms of creating either a subcommittee or some sort of an action plan. Now, we did that with ICD-10, and that's why we were so successful in implementing it, because we had a lot of information going back and forth, and we didn't run into any real hard and fast gotchas. So what we do within our subcommittees is we would, if a subcommittee is created, we follow the subcommittee process. If we don't create a subcommittee, sometimes we just create an action plan, and we've done that in the standards committee. We've created action plans on how to adopt or how to get information out or how to really handle within our own borders, if you will, or with our own participants, because we're actually out of the state of Utah, but we have a lot of participants, so we actually get them to be able to help us implement things properly. And what happens is the subcommittee can either create a new standard or update an old standard, and once they've done their job, and this time frame is probably, the shortest one I've ever done is 6 months, where we created a brand new standard. But they can go anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on how contentious the information is. Once that standard is created, it goes back to the standards committee. That is the body that is actually been given the authority by the board of directors to create these standards. The standards committee reviews it for any outstanding issues. If there are outstanding issues, it goes back to the subcommittee again for further development. If there aren't, then they vote to accept the standard and to move it forward to the UHIN board of directors. Once the standard is approved to move to the Board of Directors, it will be presented at the Board of Directors in one of their quarterly meetings. And at that time, again, they have to vote consensus to be able to move that standard on. The standard is then approved and is sent to the Utah Insurance Department. So our standards do actually have weight in terms of legislation. There's a rule, and it's called the Uniform Billing Rule, and that's Rule 59164, and that is then open and it's updated. And this portion along the right-hand side is really all about how that rule or how that standard gets adopted into the state rule. Basically, they have to open the rule up, they have to ask for comments, and then they can adopt it into the rule and do a publish. We're actually waiting right now for two rules or two standards that we put forward to the Department of Insurance that, they became rule as of the 15th. Yay! And I'll show you which ones they are. But for all intents and purposes, that's our process, and it does take time. It's a bit on the bureaucratic side, but what it does is it ensures that, again, we have that win-win situation, that we're not railroading anybody through something that they really can't adopt or can't do. And what you'll notice, like the federal government, our state rule really is on our payers. Okay, the federal government, the HIPAA rule is not about telling providers, it's about telling payers. And that's the same with the state, because they're really the only way that they can make that effective change. So just like X12, we have committees here. We have our standards committee, which, as I mentioned before, is actually gets its authority from the UHIN Board of Directors. We have a technical committee, which was also created by the Board of Directors. And then we had this year 3 specific committees. We had the Transparency Committee, we have the ABA, or the, I just want to say it's the autistic folks, because I can't remember what the ABA stands for, but we have that subcommittee, and then we also have the Telehealth Committee. So we created these subcommittees. We had one new standard, which was the ABA standard. We had the Telehealth, which was an update to a very old standard, and we also updated our transparency. Now, we can have a committee at the request of any of our participants. So if you know who your lead person into UHIN standards is, or if you'd like to just send me an email, I'm certainly happy to entertain any topic that you might have regarding standards, so we can talk about those. Just so you know, our standards group meets monthly. It has met monthly for 25 years, the first Wednesday of every month, and our meetings are from 9:30 to 10:30. And yes, you can remote in, okay? Now, what I wanted to show you here is the standard and what it looks like. So just like X12, we deal not only with HIPAA standards, but also with just X12 standards at large. And sometimes this is one where, excuse me. So what we have here, or what you're seeing at this point in time, is an administrative transaction standard. And this transaction standard actually calls for the utilization of the following acknowledgements. And those acknowledgements, not all of them are required within HIPAA. So the XML communication message is really a UHIN-specific communication message that we do, in fact, require our trading partners to use. The TA1 is also not required, but we have found that it, again, brings great utilization to our trading partners if something goes awry. The 999, not required in HIPAA. However, we in the state of Utah do require that. Now, the eligibility response, definitely required. The claim acknowledgement, how many of you believe that's required in HIPAA? Good job, no raise of hands, because it's actually not. You are correct. That is another transaction that is not required in HIPAA. They're continually trying to get it required, but as of this time, it is not. There's also the claim response, so the response to the 276, definitely required. The 277 pending, the 277 unsolicited, both of those are not required. So you can see here where we have taken X12 transactions and made them part of the repertoire or menu of what payers offer to providers. I really have to take my hat off to our payers for providing all this information, because you get outside of Utah and a lot of this isn't used, and providers sometimes truly believe they send those claims and they fall into a black box, never to be seen again. But in Utah, we have a much better relationship with our payers, and therefore they're ready, willing, and able to help our providers do their jobs. So let's stop right there for a moment. Okay, now let's move on to the X12 transaction itself. I know you folks that are in the room are at least somewhat familiar with the transaction, but let's start out with our basic X12 transaction. So this is what it looks like. Now this has been formatted a little bit differently because we've actually removed the tildes and we've put in hard returns so that you can begin to see the transaction, if you will, from head to toe. So there's the outer layer, there's the ending layer, and then there's everything else in between. So this is a complete transaction. No, none of this information is real, and we just wanted you to see what that looked like. Okay, so what you were looking at, if you look at the schematic here, this is really what you're looking at. You're looking at what's known as a hierarchical looping structure, which means that there are within each of these parts and pieces potentially more than one. What you'll notice immediately is the communication or the transport envelope is not part of X12. So if you wanted to move this using SFTP, if you wanted, I guess you could probably send it an email, although I wouldn't. You could do it that way. We here at UHIN have a number of ways to connect with you and to connect your trading partners to us. So we have an opportunity to use basically whatever communication transport you need to use in order to move your data. But outside of that, everything else within the transaction itself does have a part to play, getting the information, and making sure that things come across appropriately. So what you have are the ISA, the GS, and the ST. And those truly are the first three pieces in every single transaction that allow the transaction to be exchanged and for people to know where it's going, where it came from, and what's inside, if you will. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward and talk about those first three pieces, since they're very important. Okay, when we look at the ISA, or if you remember the most outer level next to the communication transport, what you're looking at is the ability to define the who you're sending it to and how many different parts and pieces within that entire transaction you have. Both the ISA is the beginning and the IEA is the end. This is the only, and I repeat, only piece of information within the X12 transaction that has a fixed length. Everything else is variable length, but this one is a fixed length portion of the transaction. Right next to the ISA and the IEA is the GS and GE. So if you think the ISA and the IEA as a kind of the direction or the address, you have the GS and the GE. And what that is, if you will, is like a bunch of pages inside of an envelope. So within that envelope, there could be many different kinds of transaction sets. So it could be a batch of 837s. You could have between the ISA and the IEA a batch of eligibility. You could also have a batch of prior authorizations. So you're not actually required to send one ISA, one IEA, and then within that, only one GS and GE. You can have multiple of the different collective within that transaction. So it's the, if you will, that's why it's the beginning of the second or the middle portion of the envelope. So that would be a grouping of a bunch of different kinds of transactions. And you do have to have that because you cannot send between GS and a GE. You cannot send an eligibility and a claim and a prior authorization. It has to be one, what they call functional group. So that is a requirement. I know that early on when we first started implementing these, it really was basically one ISA, one GS, and one ST. And it's because at the time, nobody had the ability to parse those out to make them, to be able to not only parse them out to receive them, but also within our systems. We have since moved forward a number of light years, and we can actually accept the entire different transaction that way. So we move forward in understanding how to use it and being able to use it effectively. Now, once you've gotten past the ISA and the GS, you now are into the ST and SE. And again, this is the transaction set. So you would have a transaction set that says, these are all my claims, and you would have a set ID, which actually helps in the matching from one payment perhaps to one claim, and then you also have control numbers. So this information, again, is very, very important, not only to start out with, but then also at the end of the segment, what you have is the same control number. So you would know if something disrupted it and you didn't get the rest of it. And that happens from time to time. Not a lot, but it can happen from time to time. So you have the three pieces that make up that enveloping, if you will, type structure. So this is what it looks like. I mean, you know, if you want a picture, there's the ISA, the GS, the ST, the SE, the GE, and the IA. What I'd like to do now is pause for a moment and ask, do you folks have any questions? Wait, where am I? Okay. All right, so let's start talking about what I like to call, it's the heart. This is the heart of the transaction. This truly is what makes a transaction a transaction. Okay, it's the loops, the segments, and the data elements. And you'll notice I put them, indented them, because each one rolls up to the next. So the smallest piece or part is the data element, which make up the segments, which make up the loops. So let's start looking at that. Okay, I just told you what it was, and here is a picture of what a full transaction looks like, okay? So what you see here is you see that there's a loop, okay? There's different loops. And then there's some segments, that's the stuff in green. And then what you do not see, however, in this are the data elements, because what this is it's a table, and you can actually find this table at the front portion of your, the front matter of your transaction. So that's where you would see something like this, and you can just real quickly look and see what's in the transaction that you may or may not need. Okay, in the transaction, again, we have another example. This is a loop, and then here are the segments, and each of the segments, some of them are pretty common, like the NM1, that's a patient name. Actually, it just means name. So it could be a patient name, could be a doctor name, could be a hospital name, could be any kind of name, but that's one of the ones. And then if you look at the actual first page on a segment, what you'll see is this little diagram. I love this diagram. This is like my favorite thing because I can tell a lot just from that little diagram. Within this diagram, what you see is anything in bold means it's required. So you could have no bold, no bold, no bold, bold. And what that would tell you is just looking at that is not required, not required, required. And then those parts and pieces, now this actually is a representation of the standard, not of the implementation usage. It is the actual standard. So what you see, these names in here are not names you know, okay? These are names that are part of the standard. The names that you know or are familiar with are actually implementation names. But what you can see here is that the very first data element is required. And generally speaking, whether the segment is used or not used, the first data element is always required. And sometimes you'll get that first data element and it's got kind of a junk because it's a placeholder. You're required to start with something. And then everything else thereafter may actually have a reason for being, and so it would be used. What's interesting is if you see this requirement indicator, and that tells you whether it's required or not. In the bottom right-hand corner, you see the maximum and minimum length, okay? Sometimes that will be constrained within the X12 implementation, sometimes it won't. In the upper right-hand corner, that is actually the data element number. For every data element number, sometimes there'll be codes, like I can tell you that data element number 98 has about 6 pages of codes that are associated. We in our transactions may use 10 or 75, but we don't use the hundreds that there are for that code. And then the only other thing that we have is the data type, which is actually in the center on the very bottom, and that tells you whether it's an alphanumeric or whether it's just strictly numeric. So you can tell a lot with this particular diagram. That's why I say I really like it, because if I'm looking for something specific, I'll always look there first rather than try and hunt and peck through the transaction. It just gives me a lot of information right quick so I know what I'm looking for. So these are the different data elements that are within the guide. So did anybody have any questions about the loops, the segments, or the data elements? On the phone? Our next portion of our presentation today is going to talk about implementation, and we are going to look at implementation in terms of both the payer and the provider. So when we talk about implementation, where you need to go to get your information is in the front matter. There are 2 sections within the front matter of every guide. Within the first section, you have the purpose and scope, and this is truly where you get all of your business information on how, by whom, and when these transactions are used. So I rely heavily on this. I don't memorize all, 12 transactions that I've worked with over a period of time, but I do know that I can find the information within the front matter by and large. And this really does give you a lot of information. It tells you about how, what is the actual exchange partners in this particular transaction. It'll give you the definitions of what is it we're talking about, and it also provides limitations for each of these transactions. So it's really important. That's why you can have one standard like the 277 and have 5 different usages, because each one serves a business purpose. And that's really where you want to pay attention is in the utilization, or how do I use this, and that is and always will be in section 1.4. So if you don't look at anything else, I recommend you look at section 1.4. Within that section, you'll have subsections. As a matter of fact, they get a little bit ridiculous. It'll be like 1.4.1.2.3.4. Okay, so it'll really go into a lot of detail, but it's very important that you understand that's where you get how to use this transaction, what things are really allowed from a business sense, and what things are disallowed. And then in section 2, that's your transaction set. That's a lot of what I've shown you here today in terms of not only the table. You remember that little table I showed you that shows you the entire transaction? Well, obviously, in some of our bigger transactions, like the claim, there'll be more than one table, and there'll usually be 3 pieces. There'll be a header, a detail, and the end or trailer portion of that table. So that's where you can look at the transaction in its entirety and kind of figure stuff out. I'm always going for the higher the level, the better when I'm looking for something specific, because I'm not going to sit and turn a bunch of pages. I will look at specific parts and pieces that I need. So that's how you can do research within that transaction. And if push comes to shove, yes, you can do a control find on any one of the transactions, but that could take you for a long time, especially if you use a word like patient, or if you use a word like provider, you can get a lot of different hits. So realistically speaking, when you're looking at it, I would go to your table first, define where you think you need to be, and then move from there. Okay, I was talking about the usage. I wanted to bring this up to show this to you. This particular 1.4 business usage is actually from the healthcare claim. And what it tells you, if you start looking at it in depth, tells you what is it. Well, it is a healthcare claim. It is encounter information, or it can be both, okay? You say, well, how or who or what? Well, it comes from the providers to payers, either directly or through an intermediary like a clearinghouse, okay? And it also, and this is what's really interesting, I don't know if you folks knew this, but it also can be used to send information from payer to payer, and that's utilized in the coordination of benefits portion of the claim, okay? Now, it says it is required, you know, if there are regulatory agencies to monitor rendering, billing, and or payment of healthcare services. So this is just one paragraph in that section that gives you all that information. What is it for? Who uses it? And in this one, it gives you some authority. So that's just the first paragraph. I copied the second paragraph because I thought it, or the third paragraph, because I thought it was also interesting. So it begins to tell you about the transaction itself, and it tells you that you're reporting to somebody, so a payer or sponsoring organization, and it also used the words adjudicate the claim. So we're talking about this in terms of not only using it as reporting, but also using it as a bill to get money back. And then it talks to some of the other transactions, okay, that are associated with this transaction. Now, the claim is usually one of the few transactions that has, if you will, follow-up or additional transactions. The eligibility doesn't really have any other transactions involved with it. It's just eligibility. However, the claim can use both the claim status as well as the claim payment. And it does tell you to see other sections. So in other words, what else is related to this particular transaction? So you begin to see a flow or an understanding of how these transactions are used together to create an entire conversation, not only on am I eligible, I'm eligible, guess what, I need a prior authorization, okay, I send that in, then I finally get my service, and then they might need some documentation, and then once that's turned in, I get my payment, okay? So you begin to see all these different workflows that help these transactions go beyond the telephone and the fax, but that can be done back and forth in a blink of an eye for all intents and purposes. Okay, so you've seen the front matter. I can't really stress that too much because, like I say, it's really the beginning of how you use it and who uses it. Once you actually start getting into the implementation itself, okay, now you're into the guide. You've gone past the front matter. The next thing that you start to look at are how is this constructed? What are the biggest parts and pieces? Well, the biggest parts and pieces, if you will, are the loops. Okay, that was the outer portion. If you remember my little stair step, there was the loops, the segments, and the data elements. Well, here's the loops. Within the loops, and I hope you remember the word hierarchical, and you're all going to be tested on that word, spelling it anyway. And so that's the very first part. Now, not every loop is required. Okay, just because you see it's a loop, it's not required. Where do you know this information? Well, two places. One, you can look at the table, which I do because I cheat, and I've learned my way around. And the second piece is actually going into the hierarchical loop and where it talks about it in that particular page. And what you'll notice is within the claim, and I use the claim because it just seems to be most common for both the payer and the provider. Within the claim, you have the usage of the subscriber as required. So that means, and here's the funny part, if I'm making the transaction, it's required, but we're only going to make the payers responsible for it. In terms of the payers are the ones that are told they have to accept these. But this is where you get your implementation, okay? So provider, if you're creating it, you are required to send this loop, okay? Which means the payer has to accept that loop, okay? Now, my second example here is about the patient. You would think you would have to have the patient, right? You don't. You do not have to have the patient loop because it is situational, okay? So payer, if the provider sends the subscriber and doesn't send the patient, you still have to accept it. Okay, so that's the difference in the implementation. I have to send it, I don't have to send it. You have to accept it, you don't have to accept it. So that's for the whole loop, so that's all the other stuff in there too, okay? But here's the gotcha for the providers. And that is with situational usage, there will be a situational rule. So what that means is, if this rule is met, the provider has to send the data. Payer can't require it, but if it meets this rule, the provider must send it. So that's why it's a give and take on these transactions. Okay, so let's look at this. So I would have thought, oh, patient's always required, but no, it's not. It says, required when the patient is a dependent of the subscriber identified in Loop ID 2000B, so that's up above, and cannot be uniquely identified to the payer using the subscriber's identifier in the subscriber level. Okay, what that's really telling you is the subscriber and the patient or dependent are different. Because if you sent in the subscriber level, the subscriber ID and the subscriber is the patient, you've identified them, right? Well, when you have these kinds of things, that's why a lot of times these situational rules, you really have to look at them closely because it may be dependent on information sent elsewhere. Okay, so that's what you begin to look at. In the loops, as with most everything else in the guides, there may be points where they are situational, but you always have that situational rule, and you will always know that, yes, you do have to use it in this circumstance. Now, there are additional notes. Okay, that's the rule right there. And then the bottom two are actually notes. And it says there are no HL subordinate to the patient HL. Remember before when I did up above, I didn't did up above. Yes, I did. Okay, so up here, what that's saying is that within this, there's nothing else beneath it, so that entire loop is not used. And then here again, it says, and this is just kind of a repeat of the situational rule, if a patient is a dependent of a subscriber and can be uniquely identified. So it's the opposite of the rule. If you can, then you send it in the subscriber level. So you begin to see they work together, okay? And what you'll be able to do is you really want to pay attention to these things. Now, what you will also notice that is unique is that in the usage under required, there's no situational rule because it's required. Required means you have to send it. However, you do see some of the TR3 notes, and again, they're complementary to each other. If the patient can be uniquely identified, okay, and then it also says if the patient is not the subscriber and cannot be identified, then you also have to use this next loop. So you begin to see that they are complementary. They tell you, provider, what you send and when you send it, and for the payer, they tell you what you expect. Okay, so that's the very first outer portion is the loop. The next thing that we have are the segments. And again, we're talking about implementation of a segment. So now let's play our game. You have a loop that is required. However, within that loop, you could actually have segments that are not required. Okay, and I just picked two, but I picked the subscriber name, so we saw up above in the actual loop that the subscriber is required, right? And so the first segment in a required loop is going to be required. Imagine that. So there are some rules. I mean, there's a lot of rules, and if you really wanted to do a deep dive into these, I could walk you through the rules. I didn't want to go quite that far today, but there are rules that tell you how these things have to be formatted in order to be considered syntactically correct. But within the loop that was actually a part of that hierarchical loop, this is the very first one, and it is required, and that's the subscriber name. So this loop, however much data is included with that, is required, okay? Now, moving on, when we look at the referring provider name, okay, these are both names, and in this one, it's situational, okay? And so in this situation, it only is required when there's a referral, okay? So you would only need this information at that point in time. And then it goes on to give, as I told you in the TR3 notes, gives you a little bit more information to help you, provider, understand how and when you use that. So you do use this when you have a provider that ordered a lab, okay? Then it also tells you where to send additional information. So you have to use additional information potentially at the 2310A and at the 2420E, okay? So you really want to read the very top part. A lot of times I know people go right into the data and they're looking at it and they don't get it. And I will get questions, but Doreen, it says this. And I'll say, okay, let's work our way back. And I will always work my way back. I will always go back to the loop, if not to the loop, then to the hierarchical loop, or excuse me, to the segment, to the loop. If not to the loop, then I go back up to the header, or actually the information that we have at the very beginning of the book to be able to understand. And sometimes that's where you find it. So as you do your research and you run into problems, that's how you want to look at these things. And make sure you read all of the notes because they're always very important. You'll notice in note 3, it says the information in this loop applies to the entire claim unless, and that's a good word, unless it's overwritten by other information in 2420 within the same value. So unless, okay, and let's just say this is a referring provider. So you had one service and the referring provider was Dr. Sarah, and you had a second service and the referring provider was Dr. Doreen. Well, you may send Dr. Sarah at the beginning, but then in one line and only one line, you have Dr. Doreen. So you have the opportunity to overwrite that data. And that's the whole idea about hierarchical. Everything at the highest level applies to everything below, unless, and there's some unlesses, unless there's something unique about a specific service line, and then at that point in time, you would put the new information. That's why you don't repeat it over and over and over and over and over again, because you always go to the highest level, put your information in there, and then it applies unless something doesn't. Okay, so that's our segment. Do I have any questions at this point in time about the looping or the segment? Do you guys? Okay, let's go ahead and look at some implementation rules about the smallest piece of a transaction, and that truly is the data element. Okay, and what I've done, again, I've picked the whole name thing because it seems to be one that's fairly prolific throughout any guide that you go into. Okay, and what you begin to see is within the element. So this, I don't remember if you remember the little boxes, but within the little boxes, it had some of this basic information. But now, what you begin to see is all of the information, only in better English. Okay, so what you have, again, remember we have, that's the name of the data element, the NM101. You have the usage, is it required or not? So it's required. You have the NM101, and then remember I told you about the data element number? That's a 98, okay? And you'll notice, and I don't know if you remember, but I told you these data elements, sometimes they have codes, and some of them are like lots and lots of codes, hundreds and hundreds. They're only using one code here, billing provider, 85. So what would you do if you needed another code? Could you use it? Raise of hands, who thinks they could use any old code they wanted as long as it was in data element dictionary? No raise of hands. Good job, guys. Yes, you are limited to that one code in this particular data element. And then you'll notice off to the side that we have that it's actually required, it's a number, and it's between 2 and 3 digits. So there are codes out there that have 3 digits. They just chose not to use them in this particular implementation. Now going on to the NM102, there's 2, person and non-person. In the NM103, we see something unique. We see an implementation name, okay, because the standard name is name, last, or organization name. In the implementation, we're talking about the billing provider last name or organizational name. So these are unique. Some of them will have implementation or industry names. Some of them won't. Now, as we go on to the NM104, the utilization of this data element is situational, okay? And it says required when, and remember, anything situational will always have a rule. Required when NM102 is equal to 1, and here's the person has a first name. So do you know people that have only one name? Perhaps Cher, Madonna. There was a guy in Utah, believe it or not, his name is Worm. He officially had his name changed to Worm. There's a gentleman running around out there in the world. I think he's still running around out there in the world. But his name is Worm. So if your name is Madonna, you don't use the first name, it's your last name. So what they're saying, because it's required, so Madonna is the only name I need to put in there because it's my only name. So you have a two-piece, okay? You wouldn't put Madonna, Madonna. You would just put Madonna, and then you would leave that situational, okay? So there's some fun little things in here that you don't think about, and you're like, well, who wouldn't have it? A lot of people wouldn't have a first name, okay? Or they have a first name, but they use it for both, so it's just one name, and that's where it goes. So that's the whole idea behind the data element. You have not only what is it, but you know how big is it, and then you also know if there are any rules surrounding it, or when you would be using it, or when you would be required to use it. Now, a name, you'll notice, is between 1 and 35. Some people, their name is an initial. You know, it could be JC. I don't know too many people with just, maybe there's somebody like with a J and then a last name, but you can do just one or none, okay? If it meets the criteria, you have to use at least one character. If it doesn't meet the criteria, then you leave it blank. So that gives you some information. And there's a lot of these in there, guys. So keep your eyes open and really read your rules because it's really important. And again, honestly, these are built, again, these are really built for the provider to understand how to create it, but it's you, payer, that are on the hook for it, okay? So kind of a fun way to think about it. All right. And this is one of those parts and pieces that goes back to the front matter, if you will. It's section 1.12.2, and it tells you when you can't reject a claim based on a situational rule. And this is actually written to the payer, okay? So what this is talking about that is if you cannot, as a payer, reject a claim if the information is submitted but not used by the payer. So this is kind of the opposite. Okay, so if in that guide it says I have to send a last name and you as a payer don't use the last name, I don't know why you wouldn't, but let's just pretend you don't use names, you don't care. Okay, maybe you're doing some capitated stuff and you just pay based on the subscriber ID, you don't really care. You cannot reject that claim. If the data are there and are required, whether you use it or not, you have to accept the claim. Okay, so this is one of those, again, going back to the front matter and looking to see what can and can't I do. So not everything is payer or provider based. There's a mix, and you really need to read when you're looking at something and you're researching something. You really need to look in all the places to make sure that you understand succinctly what it is you're supposed to be doing. Okay, so this is the idea. This is actually rejecting based on the inclusion of situational data, and it says, as a result, the submitter is not restricted from sending some information to another payer, in addition to specific payer that has a known adjudication. And where that really comes into play is in your coordination of benefits. So if payer A requires or uses all the required data, and payer B does not use all the required data, payer B cannot reject it even though it was submitted to payer A, okay? The only time this thing gets a little wonky is when payer A uses code 99213 and payer B only wants to use code 99212, okay? If they use different codes, that can become a sticky wicket, if you will. So that's why sometimes providers would prefer that even their Medicare claims don't cross over to a commercial payer, because the commercial payer may not pay under that specific code. And so what they want to do is they want to get the information back and then rebuild using the code that the commercial payer uses. So those are the kinds of business rules that are not spoken to within the implementation guide, but can still have very much an impact on the adjudication of a claim. This is what I'm saying. There's provider and there's payer implementation. Just understand which side of the fence you live on and what you're allowed to and not to do. Read your guides, folks. Okay, so we talked about X12. Now I want to talk about UHIN standards a bit. Because I told you we develop standards that are part of the billing, and what we do is we actually talk about what things we do, okay? Now, I wanted to bring up this one because we've kind of claimed standards because it's probably one of the most popular transactions, and UHIN does have a claim standard. So what we have here is we talk about these are the standards that are allowed in the state of Utah to get claim information. And the reason that we did it is because at the time, do you remember they were doing a lot of addendums? So it's like, okay, which addendum do we use? Do we not use the addendum? And so we actually put those in there as a part so that people would understand which implementation are we using. So we're using the 222A1, the 223A2, and the 224A2. So those are the ones that we have. And you can actually go into our standards and click on the links and go back and get the guides if you need them. One of the things that is interesting as we were kind of talking about it is that this actually talks about 999 as a transaction that is required, okay? So it's not required under HIPAA, but it is required under UHIN. So you want to know and be familiar with the UHIN standards because we don't always follow HIPAA and just HIPAA. We also bring in additional transactions that help everything move. Remember early on that I wanted to give kudos to our payers because they provide this additional information that really helps our providers understand what's going on with this data exchange. Another one, we talked about the acknowledgement in the claim, but we actually do have an acknowledgement standard. And we have the XML, the TA1, the 999, the 271, which is a HIPAA standard, and then some of these others that are not HIPAA standard. So we do happen to have those, and it is our standard. So if you work with UHIN and you are subject to the insurance department's rules, you use this. Now we have two payers that are not, three payers, or actually it's two payers, that are not subject to the single farm billing rule. That would be Medicaid and also DMDA. But because they're really good guys, they play ball with us and they actually follow these rules as well. So let's go ahead and see, does anybody have any questions on what I just talked about in terms of the implementation or the utilization and how that works? So next on our agenda is to look at the maintenance or updating of both X12 transactions and UHIN standards. Because I know nothing is ever perfect and nothing ever stays exactly the same. So when we talk about updating X12 transactions, one of the things that I like to let people know is that there are what we call IFRs or requests for interpretation. So in the event that you have done some research on a particular transaction and you can't find it within the data element, in the segment, in the loop, or in the information that's provided at the beginning in the usage portion in section 1.4, then you can actually ask a question. And these questions are formal questions that go forward to X12. And here at UHIN, we've put in, that I'm aware of, two, that our community said, you know, there's really no understanding. And Dave, you'll remember Linda Thomas, okay? We had a really long discussion about some information on the 999, and Linda brought up a point where there was some information that was actually really nebulous, and we couldn't figure out, and everybody had a different thought about how it works. And so what we did is we actually sent that question about a 999 off to X12, and they came out with a formal official notification, which means that anybody that has that similar question would have to reference back to that RFI because while it doesn't become part of the X12 guide, it becomes part of the instruction on how to use the guide. So it's a very formal process. It does take a little time, but they do clear up anything ambiguous. And generally what they'll do is they'll take that self-same information and in the next version of the guide, put it in there or clean up the ambiguous language. So that's really important. If you don't know what to do and the people that you talk to are going, that's a really good question, that usually means, why don't you submit that to an RFI? So there is that portion of it. Now what happens if within an existing transaction you need something different? Okay, maybe you're not getting a date of birth on a referring provider. Don't know why you'd need it, but I'm just saying, let's say you're not getting it, okay? So if the information exists within the transaction, it may be that in the next version, they just need to open it up or allow it to be used, okay? Maybe you need more than one. You want to have more than one address. Maybe you want a mailing address and a physical address, and right now I think all we have is the mailing address. If you absolutely needed it, you could ask them to repeat an address. It's in the transaction. They could actually repeat that, and that's something that you can ask, and it's considered a change request. Now, if you have something as significant as a structural change, okay, that means I'm going to add something that's not already there. That's an even longer process, but you can do that. I think we are on version 8020 at this point. So if you had any structural changes that you think would be better for that particular guide, it would be a ways out, but they'll change the underlying structure. I don't know if I've said this before, but there's actually two pieces to every guide. There is the standard, which is an all-encompassing document that has possibly every single data element in it, and then there's the implementation where we do the constraint. So any underlying structure would be to the standard, and you can actually ask for those to be updated, which take a little longer because it's a big deal to change the structure of a document. But these kinds of things, like the repeat of a segment and additional code value, they're all change requests. Well, actually, they're all three change requests, but the structure does follow a little bit of a different pathway, but you can ask for it. It's not something that has, just because we created a standard doesn't mean it's static from time immemorial. It just means it's static until somebody has found a business reason to make some sort of change. And if you really want to have a good time, request a new transaction. That's what I did. That's a very, very much it's a fun time. You get to go and stand before the X12 body and get them to vote on it and get them to tell you whether or not you can have that, and then you start the whole thing brand new. And it actually is pretty interesting. I learned a lot that probably would have taken a number more years had I not done this from scratch. So when you do, if you go out to X12, there are different parts and pieces, and it tells you how to do this all online. Okay, you could do something really simple and ask for a new code. And we've actually done that. The codes that are most often requested are new claim adjustment reason codes, claim status codes, and they've actually now taken on what we call entity. So like provider, payer, I don't know, bookmaker or something like that. So they've done the entity, and then they also are doing the service type codes, which are the different kinds of service that the payer provides to the patient, and they're usually used inside of the eligibility. So eligibility is going to be changing in the 70-30 rule because what will become fluid are the codes. So that's something for you to know and to think about in terms of, what's coming up next. Now, if you have a modification, okay, and this is the big one, it's a DSMO request, or Data Set Maintenance Organization Request. That's what DSMO stands for. That's the one that's the bigger group, if you will, not so much harder. It just takes longer, and there's a lot more approvals. You have to get approvals from, there's 5 or 6 groups within X12, Healthcare industry is just one. There's also government, there's also transportation, there's also shipping, there's also retail. So all the different groups, even though we use the 837, which really is kind of an invoice and has been geared towards the healthcare industry, there are other groups that can use that transaction if they have something that's similar to a healthcare claim. The only one I can think of off the top of my head is the property and casualty. So while they have a claim, it's a little bit different, okay? But this is the kind of stuff, or this is where you can go to request any kind of modification. Now, if you do decide to do any code modification, those are done quarterly. I attend the meetings. If you guys ever do something like that, if you'll let me know, that will help me be able to champion, because if you're not there, a lot of times they may or may not know what it is you want, and sometimes they'll just say, well, is so-and-so here, is there anybody that knows about it? And if nobody knows about it, you won't get your code. And they've got a lot of codes, they move quickly, but if you need something, let me know, and I'm happy to champion it for you and help you through the process. I'll even submit it for you. Done that a few times. So when you're thinking about a code, and this is what I want you to be prepared to do, be prepared to send your information. You have to reference, what am I looking at? Am I looking at a 5010? Am I looking at a 6020? Am I looking at a 7030? At this point in time, I probably wouldn't do any more with 5010. I would want to look at things at the 7030. You need to say, why do I need it? Okay, this is really, or not why do I need it, but what am I going to use it for? Okay, I'm going to use the code because I now have a new third-party payer that covers something, and I want a code that says third-party payer. And then you have to say the reason for the change. Well, we're now doing new business with this new section of the world, and therefore that's why we need to change it. And the proposed work could be something as simple as saying, add a new code, or what we deal with a lot are changing the nomenclature or the verbiage within a code. Okay, and sometimes we get rid of codes. Okay, code's there, and somebody's like, why are we still using this? Nobody uses this code. And we've had people come in and say, we're going to go ahead and get rid of it. So you have an opportunity to do a number of things. That's just off the first page. This is the kind of information that they will request from you if you're doing a code change, because they need to have more than, I want code XY. Okay? And if you do know, like if you know it's data element 98, and you have looked and seen the code, or if you need help with it, let me know. And we can go through the code list and say, oh, we want to add code 123. And here's why. You can actually request that, okay? So there's an opportunity to change not only what codes are there, but also in terms of the claim status and in the claim adjustment reason codes, you can actually change the wording, okay? And when you're actually going to do a project proposal, so if anybody really wants to, like I say, you think you've got an idea for a really great brand new transaction, you can go ahead and fill out this. It's a project proposal. Again, this is really, it's kind of a big deal. And you'll notice there are 6 different subcommittees. There's telling you there's communication, technical, finance, supply, transportation, and insurance. We live in the N, or the insurance world, and then this is the information you would have to fill out. But in all honesty, I think I've known of 2 actual project proposals. One was done by our very own Medicaid when they did the 834. Believe it or not, nobody was using it at the time, and one of the technical guys said, I need a way to get this information to those payers that are doing our HMO business, and so he created that all on his own, and he was a committee of 1, and he got what he wanted. It's the 834 that we see. It's very similar to the 834 that we see today, because it was what he needed. So, and I created the 838, or the EDI enrollment. So, can be done. It's a really good experience. I don't necessarily think you should over and out and do it, but if there's a real need for it, by all means, please take that on. Oh, whoops, hello. Okay, so this is where you go. You go to www.x12.org, and if you look over to the right-hand side, what you'll see is if you want to create a project proposal, it says create new proposal. If you want to do a word request, you can create that. If you're going to do code maintenance, okay, that's the that's like I was saying, it's the claim status or the claim adjustment reason code. You can go there. And if you have a change request, in other words, you want to, like I was saying, you want to add a new repeat on something, you can actually do a change request, okay? And if you just want to see what's out there, you can go ahead and browse out there, okay? And they have a lot of just basic information if you want to know about the membership or the meetings. If you click on the committees, you'll see all of the various committees. Remember, I went through those, work group 1, work group 2, work group 3. If you really want to see everything that's out there, click on that and you'll see a laundry list. You'll also see the co-chairs. So if you ever have a question about something and you're not sure whether it belongs in an RFI, a lot of times you can hit up the co-chairs. I mean, I get questions on the stuff that we're working on, and you can just shoot them a question, and if they say, oh gosh, you know, you really need to submit an RFI, they'll tell you. Okay, so they're pretty good. And again, volunteer folks are doing this, so you may not get a response that day. It may take a day or two, depending on what their schedules are like. But by and large, they're pretty good about looking at that. So, do I have any questions on updating, maintaining, or changing an X12 transaction or document? So, I told you we would go through not only the X12 process, but also how that coincides with what we do here at UHIN. And you see, I repeated the same picture, because in reality, it doesn't have to be a new standard. It can be an existing standard. And most often, when we see the standards, they are updated for, it could be for more than these 3 things, but these are the most common. So let's say there's a new code that comes out. Okay, a lot of times we'll update for the new codes. We did that actually with our telehealth because there were new codes that were created, so we included those codes within our standard. So that was something that came up. In terms of new coverage, okay, that's like the ABA. Believe it or not, that was legislation that came out of the 2015 legislature that required payers to do coverage for the autistic children. And so it was the ABA group that came to us and said, oh my goodness, Doreen, we have to bill every single payer differently. Can we please consolidate this or get it where everybody is speaking the same thing? So we sat down and we actually looked at all of the codes. We went to the national level and looked at what they were doing. And we looked to see, you know, anybody else at the ABA Association themselves. And what we were able to do is to create that billing standard that now all the payers will accept the same codes and understand them to mean the same thing. Our information based on that standard was actually rolled up to the AMA. They're the ones that actually host all of the codes that are allowed to be used within the professional billing. So the services that are provided are actual professional billing services. So what was neat is they were able to use our standard to look and see how to actually standardize that and create the correct coding that everybody understood. Now that won't come out until 2019, but our standard is effective as of today. So the beauty of that is we were able to get out there, get it done first, and then roll it up to the national level. And many times you'll see that. Something will start out new in one spot in the United States. Next thing you know, everybody's got rules about it, but the rules will generally say, thou shalt cover these services, and then it just says nothing more. It doesn't tell you how, doesn't tell you what's appropriate clinically, and it's really nice when you can sit in a room with the clinical people and actually have them say, well, it really doesn't work that way. It works like this. That way, the information that's submitted from the provider to the payer is something that's real. They're not asking for something that we just don't have that information, or that's not how the services are provided. So that's what we have in terms of the new coverage. And then, as I mentioned, legislation. So the legislature, depending on what's important to somebody, can actually be convinced to create legislation like they did with the autistic services. There were enough families that went forward to the legislature and said, hey, we need this coverage. You're covering everything else. Why are we not covering this too? And so they actually did that. And it's, who was the senator that spoke at the HIT meeting? Shisawa? Okay, so he's actually the sponsor of the bill that actually requires payers to cover these services, and he has seen our standard. He was really excited because it wasn't just a mandate, now everybody go figure it out on your own. It was a mandate that now has support of the insurance department to be able to have this billing done appropriately, so that when they go to gather information, they actually compare apples to apples instead of apples to pineapples. You know, close but not quite, right? So that's what's really nice about our standards. And again, our standards, two things. One, they're a lot easier to change than an X12 standard. And two, you get to be, for all intents and purposes, the leaders or the person steering our efforts to make a standard. So when we walk out of here, remember I told you it was consensus. When we walk out the door, everybody is a win-win. So that's the really nice thing about standards here at UHIN. The documents are living documents, and it takes you folks to actually create them, and then you folks get to implement them. And that's why we have been so successful in what we do here at UHIN regarding standards. Okay, so I'm coming to the very end. If you want to see standards, you can go out to the UHIN standards page. We've had some updates, so I do have to say a disclaimer in that some of our standard links are broken. They're not working quite the way. I've got to do a thorough investigation. Haven't had a chance, but I've been notified, so we will be doing that. But as you go out here, you can begin to see the standards that are there, so we invite you to do that. Also, I've put my name at the top, and that's because if you ever run into something and you think, hey, why can't we make this all the same? You may not think of it in terms of the standard, but why can we not make this all the same? Then you're welcome to reach out to me, and I can have that discussed at a standards meeting. And our standards meetings, again, they're every first Wednesday of the month. They start at 8:30, and we invite anybody. I mean, it truly is, of the UHIN meetings, it's the one that is open to any and all. Okay, and we've had the only folks, and I'm not going to say we don't like them, but we don't necessarily always want to have this top-heavy, our vendors, and it's because it's not a vendor situation. Truly is payers and providers working together, and there are certain things in the providers world that are done in certain ways because of protocols, whether that be an AMA or an AEA or, you know, American Medical Association and American Hospital Association and the AHA, because there are protocols that are followed that are created by those associations that need to be done. And sometimes a vendor will have a different view because they're there to try and make things work the best that they think, but in reality may not be how things really go down in a doctor's office or on the payer side. So, you know, everybody's invited. We have had from time to time vendors stop in, but they don't generally stick around because what we're talking about is standardization. And to some extent, standardization actually kind of has an opposite effect on the vendor because we've now just maybe taken away some of their proprietary work that don't need to be done. But it helps our payers and providers speak off the same page. So by all means, please contact me. If you don't know, oh, you know what, I even spelled it wrong. It's UHIN, not UHI. Please don't go on that one. I'll fix it before I send this out to you guys. But if you ever have any questions about today's presentation, about standards, whether they're UHIN standards or X12 standards, by all means, I answer questions. I obviously provided this training for you guys. And let's go ahead and stop right here to see if anybody has any other questions about what we just talked about.